record on the computer. Okay, so why do we celebrate Women's History Month? Well, for many, many reasons. It's because women, the full participation of women is so key, not only to our economy and our society, but also to our democracy. And yes, we want to celebrate all the good things, all the women who have been pioneers in the forefront fighting alongside with men, of course, for equality, racial justice, economic equality, democratic ideals, all the things that we're all fighting for. And especially women of color, they have also been for the most part, been a key component in leading this fight. And I say fight because it's not over. We have so many things that women have advanced, our rights have advanced. Well, debatable in some areas, but yes, we have made advances, but there are also big gaps in what needs still to happen. And there's still the progress is there, but there's still a lot of barriers that are systemic and that we need to address. So our speaker today is Abby Kreckel. She is the Community Engagement Manager for MomsWork, and she will explain what MomsWork do for the community. It's powered by the National Council for Jewish Women. So with that, one more thing I wanted to tell you, she has 2 kids, a cat,
two cats.
Two cats, a spouse, and a fixer-upper home in Pittsburgh. So take it away, Abby.
Thanks for the intro, Christy. I'm really glad that you reached out to me. I've partnered a lot with the Career Development Center through work. So it's really fun to kind of reach some of the JFCS community on like this other level. And like I said before, I wish I could be there in person, but I have my kiddos got croup. And so I do not want to spread it. It is not fun and you don't want it. So I'm glad I'm not there, even though I miss you all. So I'll share my screen. I kind of made a couple of slides that are more photo based just to give a reference to what we're talking about. But like for everyone who's on Zoom in particular, like take that bar and drag it over so that you see more of the faces than just the slides. I want to make sure it remains kind of conversational. But I'm kind of a visual learner. So I think that a little like half people, half visuals would be a good look. So just give me 1 second to share my screen.
Is there something in the chat?
All right, can you guys see my like little Google slide situation here?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And like I said, just everyone on Zoom, just make the people's visuals a little bigger just to keep it conversational. So I was really excited about this topic. I know a whole lot about just women's history in the workforce, especially when it comes to working moms. And so I got to kind of round out my knowledge to include, people who don't have children as well, or their children are older, or maybe it's before they're having children. So this was a really exciting topic for me. And I love Rosie the Riveter. That's my background on my computer. It's very inspiring and just like I just kind of love like propaganda posters in general. That's another rabbit hole. But I just wanted to kind of start there because I think there's a lot of interesting history behind kind of Rosie and that we don't know about, something that I was telling Christy and it just like blew her mind. All right, so just what is MomsWork, right? MomsWork, we're the only organization in the Pittsburgh region solely focused on strengthening and supporting working moms, which, as you may know, and I'll have some data on that later, is one of the groups most hard hit by the pandemic. Our workforce participation levels for women in general just plummeted. When the pandemic hit, it really exacerbated, as we know, many existing social ills. So whenever there was a weakness, it exploded during the pandemic. And so you may have heard of the Center for Women. That's us. We rebranded. So Center for Women served women in transition, and MomsWork, we sort of heighten that focus based on the community need. We're really good at kind of pivoting. Pivot is like the vocab word of the pandemic, right? We're good at pivoting to address social needs. So what a little bit of what we do, we offer networking and support. So some of that looks like we have a LinkedIn Facebook group where it's private. Working moms can share job postings from their team along with a down low of what it's really like to work there. Many people now, it's been going for about 3 years, and a whole chunk of people have actually found their dream jobs through that group, which is super exciting. I actually believe I found this job through that group. I wasn't in the group at the time, but a friend of mine saw it and sent it to me, and that's how I'm here. So it's like a really, really awesome resource that I'll make sure is sent out in a follow-up. So if anyone wants to join, you can join. So networking and support, our support opportunities are, we run a free monthly drop-in working mom support group. This includes to address like accessibility barriers for like a single mom or maybe their partner, spouse, or other caretakers not available to watch the kid. We have free babysitting, snacks, tea. It's really awesome. It's group therapy. It's facilitated by an amazing therapist who's over at Forward Wellness. And it is so valuable, and a lot of friendships are being built through that. Again, sort of that social community really was gutted during the pandemic. And a lot of people had children during the pandemic and just had no community at all. So we do a little bit of that. We do advocacy. So a lot of the statistics I'm going to tell you today are very disturbing and like makes you want to do something, right? And whether you're like a woman or not, there's a lot of room for people to raise their voices, to share some of these stories and experiences with those in power, whether it's just fellow voters, whether it's your legislator, whether it's a media story. Those are all kind of opportunities that MomsWork connects people with to drive change. And more on that later. We also offer education. So during the pandemic, we offered a lot of virtual workshops with the Career Development Center, and doing things like LinkedIn networking, doing things like what to do with a resume gap, like how to address that in the job search, remote work job search. We had a lot of really interesting education topics, things like budgeting basics for women, like what to do with that tax return, like sleep tips from a pediatrician, right? Like it's a whole range of stuff. And we're pivoting a little bit more to in-person. So this Friday, we have a career day. It coincides with a Pittsburgh Public School half day. So we also have childcare. And there's going to be 3 workshops. There's going to be professional headshots. Even we're going to have a rack of blazers from our thrift shop, Thriftique, for people to put on if they don't feel like they have the right work gear for their headshots. So it's going to be just like a really fun all-in-one event. Yeah, so that's MomsWork. And we're powered by National Council for Jewish Women. And so I'm kind of like a bit of both. I'm mostly MomsWork, but there's so much programmatic overlap. And NCJW does a lot of like voting, reproductive rights, and different things like that, just general women's empowerment, not just mom specific. Any questions on that, guys? Cool. All about me. This is a picture of my kiddos and I when we went to the Grand Concourse for brunch recently, when it was a little warmer. So that's Anna and Gina. And I graduated from Pitt in 2013, and I got a job in the workforce right off the bat. Like my manager went on maternity leave and then was let go her first day back. And so I'm immediately like, whoa, whoa, this system is really messed up. And it was, technically illegal, but companies get away with this all the time. So that's just one example of like, ooh, it's a little rough there. I also was faced pretty quickly with sort of the pay inequities in gendered work. So in nonprofit work, which is more dominated by women, right? We often see like lot lower salaries than people in corporate roles, which can be dominated by men. And so that's some of those pay equity issues started being really clear to me from the beginning as I watched kind of my male spouse, like his career, his paychecks take off. And even as my career was taking off, it wasn't exactly the same. When I got pregnant with Gina, my oldest, I kind of looked at policies. I looked at maternity leave. I looked at daycare costs, and I was just like, I don't think I can do that. Right. Like I had her a little younger, and I was just like, I don't think I'm in a place where I can make this work. So I took a caregiving break, which as many people know, like if you're out of the workforce for even a year, it can affect your entire like future earnings. And often women are the ones making these career breaks, again, because of the gendered pay. If you sit down, you do the math. Sometimes the math ends up that a caregiver needs to stay home, and often the person earning less is if it's in a straight relationship, it's the woman. So a lot of these inequities really manifest in our lives. And yeah, that's me. Like I said, I got a fixer-upper house. It's a lot of work. It's kind of a bummer, but it's in a great neighborhood. So it's one of those Pittsburgh things, right? I got to do the millennial dream of, removing carpet and having hardwood underneath. So that's it's Pittsburgh for you. And I came here for college and stayed, and just love being outdoors. I love our city. I just think it's a really fun place to be with a lot of people doing really interesting and important work. So yeah, that's about me. And I have some kind of quotes here to ground us in what role women play in history. And I really liked these two. From Gerda Lerner said, "Women have always made history as much as men have, not contributed to it. Only they did not know what they had made and had no tools to interpret their own experience. What's new at this time is that women are fully claiming their past and shaping the tools by means of which they can interpret it." And then from our hero, Michelle Obama, "The measure of any society is how it treats its women and girls." And just, I don't know if anyone's seen some of these different developments online and news articles and such, but two examples of women's role in history. Most early cave art, so our earliest record of kind of civilization, they've done analysis on it, and it was women who made it, because a lot of it involves handprints and sort of the bone structure and the smaller, comparing it to sort of skeletons from that time. They're like, these were women who were creating the earliest art, the earliest record of civilization. Also, in archaeology, they were digging back and seeing the earliest calendar, right? And it was a 28-day, it was notches on a bone. And it was, for a long time, men were saying like, yeah, this was man's first calendar. And they finally dug into it more and sort of analyzed it. And they're like, well, this was a woman tracking her cycle that created the first calendar, right? So I think that just to kind of flip the script a little bit, often when history is talked about, we just see names of male leaders, names of wars that they got into because they were annoyed at each other, were trying to steal each other's land. But really, just to try to frame it a little differently and flip the script, that women really have this crucial role in society that, when you pick up a history book, it's not, unless you pick something that's like a feminist history, right? Like, which is more niche, you're not going to see some of just that true history there, which I don't know. I find some of those early examples really, really compelling, and it kind of challenges some of the assumptions I have learned, Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts or questions about kind of that bit about framing women in history?
Cost code for that program.
What's that?
Which program?
RSS Ukraine, the one where the state asked you.
Oh,
What happened?
Where the state was like,
I'm like, we've talked about two things today.
this was last week.
Can you guys hear that? What is
Oh, this is a cost center.
Yes, it exists now, and I'll have staff.
Hold on.
Just hire the staff still, but in the meantime, I'll have staff start. Are you in a meeting?
I think we're picking up.
I
from
think
another
we're picking
meeting.
up somebody's,
Okay.
hold on one second.
I think it looks like she muted. That's okay. We're
Okay.
good. We're good.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Okay. So
Oh,
life is
How did that
So-
I'm
Okay.
sorry, Abby, but go ahead, please.
That's fine. So I wanted to just take a minute to kind of once again to ground some of the history. I think a lot of us have really interesting examples for our own families and our own kind of ancestors about like women's work. And I would love to, obviously we could all probably talk about family stories for like the whole hour. So like, let's try to keep it brief. Like if anyone wants to give an example, and I'll start. So I just wanted to give an example of my grandmother, who was a home economics teacher here in Pittsburgh. This was before she had children. And then when she married, and then when she became visibly pregnant with her first, she was fired. And that was very normal. And this was in the 1950s, in the mid to late 50s that this happened. Another female ancestor of mine, my great grandma, she did for paid work, she ironed neighbors' clothing and kind of pressed and cleaned them, and did that while she was watching her kids, so that she had no childcare. And this was in the like 20s, 30s, that she did that. So does anyone else have an example to sort of illustrate like women in history in the workforce from your own family? And feel free, anyone, to jump in and share.
I'll jump in. My grandmother came over from Italy, and when she came over, she had I think 6 younger siblings, and she actually went to work in the glass factories and put all of her siblings, helped support them through high school, got them through college, and after they were done, she went back to college and became a teacher.
Wow, when was this?
Probably she came over in the early 30s, when she was probably like a young teenager. So probably more into the 40s, when she finally got back into things.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. Does anyone else?
I can. You don't have to unmute.
My grandmother was a runaway from Puerto Rico, and she somehow made it here to the United States. And when she got here, she would pass for white. So she was she was light enough that she could pass enough for white, and she did for many years. And so she had employment, but then when it was discovered that she was an African-American woman, which she technically wasn't, but she was a woman of color. She didn't have employment, and her employment became that of being a tarot card reader.
Oh, wow. It's incredible that she kind of like made this, she kind of had to play the system a little bit, which is it's unfortunate. Like, I just am thinking of one of my best friends who, when she was going for interviews after grad school, she was pregnant and she had to find dress clothes that were really unflattering, that just hid it and made it look like she was like a little like chunkier than she was, right? And having to hide it feels really, really bad. That's a bad feeling, you know? And so a lot of women had to do that. And then she found a way to have a career that she could do without being stigmatized racially. That's an amazing story. What decade was that?
That was the 30s and 40s.
Wow. All right, maybe like one more person. Does anyone else want to go? Just one more?
I can go. My grandfather, when he died, this is in the Philippines. They owned land. They owned rice fields, and so my grandmother had to take over, and she had 2 little kids. And I have to kind of wonder how she did it, because at that time, women in the Philippines were definitely not the dominant. They're more subservient to the men, but I think she was really good with the money, and she was good with lending money to farmers. And also, like, I remember this one time when there was a farmer asking for a certain amount of money, and he said that he was going to pay it off because he was having a problem with, I guess, the crop that year. And my grandmother said, I'm not going to lend you all that money because I know that's going to be really hard for you to pay back. So why don't I do this? I will give you half of what you're asking and you don't have to pay me back. Like, she was able to navigate that way, being able to know who the people were that were working and still be somewhat generous, but at the same time, you know, smart about her business.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's what it reminds me of, a story that I'm reading about a Jewish woman in Germany in the 1600s. And she like sort of became this businesswoman only kind of with the power of like widowhood behind her. And that was sort of like a societal role that almost gave her permission to act on her own now. It's just, wow, these are really amazing stories. Like, thank you all for sharing. That kind of, it's fun to talk through and remember the people, you know, behind the history, like, because history can get dull if it's not presented in the right way. And just reminding, like, all those decades that we gave examples from, we're going to talk about them in a minute too, so we can kind of think of those people that we just heard stories of behind. There's a really good paper from Sonia Michael of University of Maryland that just gives these really beautiful examples of women's and mothers' history in America in the workplace. And so she had all of these examples of just ways that women worked with their children. So Native American women strapped newborns to cradle boards or carried them. Pioneers laid infants in wooden boxes on their plows. That one was amazing to me. It was trying to pushing a stroller, but you're like tilling dirt with your baby on the plow. That's kind of wild. And then of course, also just thinking about like the racial element to the ways that African American children and moms in the past were treated a lot differently and a lot worse. Such as like this example here was kind of sad. You know, African American mothers saying white babies to sleep while their own little ones had to figure out how to comfort themselves. You know, and a lot of the history of childcare is it can be really divided along racial lines. And I try to do my best to kind of capture those dual tracks of history rather than like just focus on one. Again, like, you know, if men are focused on in the textbooks, it's similar. Sometimes white people have their stories told and Black people don't. Yeah, migrant laborers have their kiddos over in tents getting shade. Cannery workers and shellfish processors would often have their kids helping work alongside them. So for a lot of the past, you know, women would just work and the littler kids would be with them. And then the older they got, maybe they'd go to work with their dads. It's only been, you know, in the past, so many people were farmers that, you know, families would work together to, like, irrespective of gender lines. And it would just depend on, like, women wouldn't have these different gendered work as much as men and women do today. But I just thought those examples of history are really just to try to like think about those people. And then to switch, you know, kind of to modern times. This is a metaphor I really like to use because so childcare is infrastructure. It's like a bridge. If work is on the other side of the Fern Hollow Gully, right, and you're over on the Regent Square side and work's on the other side, without the infrastructure of childcare, you literally can't get to work. So I just thought that was really illustrative. And local example, it's pretty close to all of us. Basically, at the end of the 19th century, American childcare had come to consist of a range of formal and informal provisions that were primarily associated with poor and minorities and immigrants, and were stigmatized as like charity. So America has a really weak foundation for building in the 1900s social services, because in our country in particular, they were always associated with charity and the poor, and because of social stigmas, which shouldn't have been there anyway, but because of these stigmas, that's why we had in America, our system got built up around women and our treatment and women's treatment when they're having children and how to care for children. All of that was framed in a rich versus poor, looking down on people. So when you look sometimes at other countries and you see like, wow, they really have it figured out, to a lot of it's really rooted in American history, and it's almost like not a happy accident, it's like a sad accident, right? That it's really rooted in some deep 2-3 centuries old pieces of history that are, you know, if we want to make change, we kind of have to overcome some of those those inner stories that people have. And yeah, I just noted, you know, girls and women need to be empowered to choose if or if not they want to have a family, and if they do, they need to have access to quality, affordable childcare, or else, you know, then they can't get to work across the Fern Hollow Gully. So I did a little bit of the past, but I didn't want to go too much further back. But I did want to talk a little bit about what America's childcare system and working women in general looked like in the 40s. So think of the 40s. My great grandma was ironing, right? She was ironing for neighbors and did not have access to childcare. By the 40s, her kids were starting to get older. And in the 40s, if Rosie the Riveter had kids, then how did she do her riveting? It's called the Lanham Act. So in World War II, it was viewed as an economic need that women needed to be in the workforce, and it was acknowledged federally that, you know, moms needed to also be in the workforce and join, like we mentioned, we heard someone earlier worked in the factory, and she didn't have children. Well, that was always very common. You know, women could start working in factories at that time, but the government recognized the need that if you had kids, you needed to be in the factory too to support the war effort. So the Lanham Act was passed, and about 600,000 kids were in these fully federally funded local childcare centers all across the country. And worth noting, these were primarily white kids. There was a lot of segregation at that time. So this was definitely not perfect. But I have some pictures here of a little bit of what those nursery schools and daycare centers looked like. And this one's going to blow your mind. Not only did they often have on-site pediatricians and nurses to give the kids their regular checkups and vaccinations while they were at childcare, which is that doesn't happen anywhere today even. But they also had, because moms alone, you know, dads over abroad fighting the Nazis, right? And they would actually have hot meals ready to go to carry out for these families at pickup. So you're tired from your day at the factory, you don't need to go home and cook. You just grab your like free dinner for you and your kids. Can you believe that?
That would be so awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that is like, this was what, 80 years ago. And that was real in the US, and people could afford to work and send their kids to childcare and have this beautiful system that worked for them. This was like ancient history in the US. Like this, we could do this again if we had the willpower, right? That just blows my mind. And there's some interviews if anyone wants to learn a little more about that. There's a podcast called No One Is Coming to Save Us by Lemonada Media. It's like Spotify, Apple Music, like wherever you get your podcast. If you go all the way back to the first 4 episodes, they kind of documentary style go through this, and they actually interview like a quite elderly woman who was one of the teachers at these centers, and then an older man who was one of her students, and they talk about what it was like. And you know, she talks about how they give the kids like their liver, like cod liver oil supplements, you know, which was what was recommended at the time. And you know, that she talks a bit about what that looked like, and it was even different and more involved than childcare is today. So yeah, maybe we'll do a follow-up email where I can give you guys the link, but it's incredible, and nobody talks about that, and we should all know that this is US, like the US legacy has this to look back on. So then we get the 50s. This is when my grandma was fired for being visibly pregnant, right? So just a decade before, it looked a little different. The 50s, the Lanham Act was allowed to expire. So all of that federal wartime funding to childcare centers was allowed to expire, not renewed, despite many people calling for it to remain, despite many women having really enjoyed that newfound independence. So the women who remained at work were primarily single or childless, and there was a lot of gendered work here. So many women were teachers, nurses, you know, teacher like my grandma, nurse, stewardess, librarian, secretary, factory worker. And this is from the National Archives. There were many newer fields for women that we were moving into, like engineering, pharmacy, real estate, and finance. And there's a picture of a teacher from a teaching program. And then here's some airline, I think they call them air girls, like one of the first like groups of stewardesses, airline stewardesses. And really, I like to view the 50s as like, it was a social experiment. Suddenly we saw the history of how people would work when they had children throughout all of human history, right? How they would work, you know, and have their kids play nearby, have them sleeping in a tent. Suddenly in the 50s, US women were systematically forced when they were mothers to do something very few women in any other era of human history have done, not work at all. And so people like to talk about like, oh, the 50s. It's like, that was a radical social experiment, right? There were very high rates of like depression and people needing like antidepressant drugs, which at the time were not as good as they are today. So that was a really rough time for women, being stuck in gendered work, being forced to not work when you had children because there was literally no way to, especially imagining that you tasted something very different in the 40s. So to kind of frame that about what it was like just a decade before, and then now here's what it's like now, and why am I not happy, right? Like, why is it so hard? It was just better just a decade before. That one just really frames the 50s for me of like, 40s were like this. Well, so jumping ahead a little bit to the 70s, there was a huge economic need and desire of women to work when they had been pushed out, like when they had children. I really liked this protest sign. Popular culture was really starting to show the shift. Alice and the Mary Tyler Moore Show were both very popular shows at the time, and one had a single working mom, one had a single working woman. And they even depicted pay inequity 50 years ago. They were showing like, wow, they really should pay women as much as men. And liberated fashion choices like, you know, pants, as pants are great. The 70s also had that was another time that we were very close to having universal childcare in the US again. We were very close. So it was called the Comprehensive Child Development Act. Congress unilaterally, like bipartisan, like almost 100% passed it. So we could have had in the 70s the beginning of a universal, very affordable, everyone has access to it childcare system. Reagan and Nixon kind of took it down together, but we were really close. It was on the president's desk and everyone supported it. And then there's a little more history there. I was listening to an NPR article recently about just digging into the history. It was sort of this, Nixon took a trip to communist China and it sort of changed his mind about, he went to like a childcare center in China and he was like, we can't have anything like this in the US. Despite the fact that, you know, American moms wanted this, right? That he just was like, this is communist and we can't do it. So it was sort of a bit of like a late Red Scare situation that ended up taking it down. But that's what switched the tide, but we were like so close. Yeah, so that was the 70s. Before I jump into some of these statistics, I'll note that we do in the US within the military actually have universally guaranteed affordable high quality childcare. Because the military recognizes the need to maintain all of their female employees when they decide to have children, if and when. So we actually do have that, similarly to how the military has like guaranteed housing and other supports like that the broader society doesn't have. They also have childcare. So we do have a modern day example of the US pulling this off, even on a very small scale. So today, like I mentioned earlier, you see that point during the pandemic where women's workforce participation levels plummet. And that one is associated not just with moms, but with women make up the majority of service industry workers. What was shut down, restaurants, sometimes, you know, everything besides grocery stores, that was all shut down. And school went virtual, schools were closed immediately. And so all of those things happened. And women were either pushed out or really forced out because you can't, you know, do your 40-hour-a-week full-time job as well as be a 40-hour-a-week full-time teacher. So that was pretty rough. We went back to 1980s levels of women workforce participation, and we've made up some ground since, but it's still not all the way. A lot of people talked a lot about the Great Resignation. You know, is that younger people being lazy, they, you know, don't want to work? No, it was women who were forced out of the workforce and now can't find anything at their skill level. So maybe they don't want to be mega underemployed, or maybe they've lost skills, lost their personal connections because they were forced out when schools closed and no one was there to take care of their kids. The Great Resignation is primarily women, and it's not for any of the reasons that like kind of pundits will say. It's just women were forced out because of this major societal and structural kind of collapse. Something I like to note, and we talk about this with girls, that wow, girls are so smart, you know, girls are really advanced academically. Well, that doesn't stop, you know, women are higher educated than men on average and have higher education levels than ever. And yet we still have massive pay inequity and aren't in positions of power, like despite the fact that women are very highly educated, very highly skilled. And that one just kind of boggles the mind. It's like there's clearly something that's not working right now, because everyone would benefit from highly educated, highly skilled people in power, like regardless of gender, right? Like you would think it would make sense. And then the childcare crisis, like for example, in Pennsylvania, we're short, I think 4,000 childcare workers right now. If Target's starting wage is going to be 24 an hour and the childcare center is going to do 7 an hour, you can't do the job you love. Like you just can't sustain a family. You can't sustain even like your rent on those kinds of pay levels. And so, yeah, the childcare crisis, not only is it very unaffordable for families, you know, it can be $2,000 a month at some of the good centers for one child. If you have 2 or 3 children under 5, you know, usually you have children a year or 2 after each other, maybe 3 at the most. Like that's maybe up to $4,000 or $5,000 a month in childcare costs. I mean, that's just like bonkers, right? Like who's earning that kind of money? And so many people who want to have kids don't because they just can't afford it. And in PA, there's not enough spots right now for childcare. So 56,000 kids are sitting on wait lists. So these are people whose parents want to work but can't. These are people who maybe had a job lined up, but they can't get care, and so they have to resign. I have a mom who I worked with. She's up in the North Hills. When she was on maternity leave, you know, the moment she got her positive test, she called all the centers around her. She got on all the wait lists. She had to pay to get on those wait list spots. So like hundreds and hundreds of dollars. By the time her due date was approaching, none of them had room at all. And so she's just like, wow, like I did what I was supposed to do. I got on the list the moment I got my positive test. So she finally lined up a nanny. Nannies in the Pittsburgh region cost 25 to 30 an hour right now. And she got her nanny. She went back to work for 1 week at 3 months, you know, so she took off without pay for 3 months. As she's paying all of these waitlist fees, as she's paying, you know, all of that. Well, then a week in, the nanny got a new job offer with better pay than her 30 an hour. And she quit. And so this woman had to quit her dream job and be a reluctant stay-at-home mom because there was no one to care for her kid. So that's the childcare crisis, right? Like that's a lot. Out of school time, so you can't really just age out when you get up to, you know, kindergarten. There's about 80 weekdays that school is out that, you know, that parents need to cover for their kids. Compare that with the average 20 days of PTO a parent gets. And think of all the sick days, right? That a kid might need to be out for 5 days minimum when they have a COVID-like symptom. That's just not going to cover it. My own kids were paying $5,000 for a summer camp, and like $5,000, right? Like it's very expensive, and that's not the most expensive camp. So yikes, there's a crisis, right? Out of school time, like you can't really age out of it. It's hard right now to have kids. Not to mention like Build Back Better, we were going to have a guaranteed cap of 7% max of a parent's income going to childcare. And when you compare that, I think the average salary in Pittsburgh for a household is in the upper 50s. Compare that to that like $2,000 a month of childcare if you have 2 kids under 5, and that's way more than 7% of your income. So Build Back Better was going to guarantee subsidized childcare. It was going to make sure that all families could now kind of afford breathing room, afford to have kids. That failed. And also just inflation. I know everyone kind of feels the pinch at the grocery store. Kids' snacks in particular are really spiking in inflation, and just things are hard right now, kind of for everyone. So that's a little dark. Let's get one more dark slide, then I'll be hopeful again. So the pay gap. This past week, we just celebrated equal pay, or we didn't celebrate it. We booed it. I don't know. There's not a good word. We solemnly observed equal pay day. So last week, for the average white man, he would work January 2022 to December 2022, and he'd earn, you know, $1, right? We'll just for the sake of statistics. A woman would have to work all the way through last week to earn that $1. And so what that looks like when you flip the decimals and the fractions. So when a white man earns $1 for the same amount of work, average woman earns 82 cents. The racial gap shows even deeper here. For Hispanic women, they earn 58 cents on the dollar to a white man for the same amount of work, and Black women 63 cents on the dollar. So that's a lot. Where do we go from here? Like I said, the US military is doing the childcare system, but a lot of states, I believe it's Idaho, they've had universal childcare since and they call it's pre-K in particular, so it's three and up. They've had it since the 90s. It's been great. Everyone just loves it. It works. New York City just passed universal childcare a few months ago. Boston has some programs. Portland, Oregon has some programs that are working towards guaranteed, accessible, affordable childcare. And really, I think federally things can get kind of a mess. To kind of give a little bit of hope, the local and state political processes are a lot easier to get involved in. And that's kind of some of the advocacy stuff that I was referring to earlier. Within the state political process, we have like up to as few as 10 constituents going to your rep about an issue can change their mind. 10 people. Like we tracked last year at MomsWork how many people we connected to their reps, and we made about like 70 connections for people to their representatives. I'm like, so we could have actually pushed the needle on some of these people's, minds. So yeah, I definitely, when things seem kind of dark, I like to remind myself that like just 10 people, that's us on this call. It's more than 10 people. We could change like a state rep's mind on this. Local, like city council members, county council, that's even easier. Like that's even fewer people. So it's something to really pay attention to is some of these local elections. I'm submitting questions for like the different local county races to kind of present some of the data that I was showing you, to get them to address these issues, because it's just so important. So I just want, everyone on this call to commit to, for this Women's History Month, celebrate it by, making a pledge to yourself and to each other to vote for candidates who are going to advance women, not only to close the pay gap, and the racial pay gap and the racial equity gaps, and help fund childcare for women who choose to be mothers. Really voting is just like the biggest thing here. It's, yeah, I think there's a lot of change happening already. A lot of people are starting to talk about like paid family leave right now at the federal level. And that's just because people like us are just being the squeaky wheel. Like, we got to do something about this. Another kind of fun statistic, people are like, well, childcare is super expensive. Like, how could the federal government fund this? Well, for every dollar that federal or state government spend on childcare, you earn up to $13 back in income taxes from those working moms. It pays for itself. Like, we view most things like, road maintenance, the postal service. Those are public services, and it's fine if they lose money. Like, that's what our tax money's for. It's for services. This is a public service that makes us money back, right? It's incredible, actually, when you think about it that way. Like, no program earns back more in tax money. Like, it's incredible. And yeah, I mean, I really just think we just need to vote. Many states and cities have a lot of good things going on, including, I'm hoping we can do something like this in Pittsburgh. There's nothing in the works right now, but it would just be really cool. I know Ed Gainey, our mayor, if anyone's living in Pittsburgh, he talks a lot about, community violence prevention, which that's something that out of school time funding can help with. He talks a lot about kids education. He talks a lot about school. Pre-K made it on to his agenda because a lot of us submitted questions and stories into his platform when he was building his agenda when he first came in. So he's talking about it. I do think that there's a lot of hope here. It's like almost like a mixed blessing, right? That the pandemic really sucked and it threw a lot of stuff into the spotlight. But what I would really hope from some of this is that it made it clear that something has to happen, because society needs, women to have like power in order to advance as a whole, because we're like just over 50% of society, right? Like, we need to be thriving so that society can thrive. And yeah, that's just, if you feel like, yeah, I totally want to connect with my legislator on this. I just wanted to throw out there, all the work that we do at NCJW and MomsWork. Like, I run our social media, and I put a lot of our opportunities on that. And we have lovely newsletters and lots of in-person events. such as, you know, if you know anyone who is a working mom and might really benefit from that support group I mentioned, it's every third Thursday. It's up on our website. You can RSVP there. We also have our career day on Friday, 1 to 4 p.m. Over at 1620 Murray. You can RSVP for that too on our website. And really just any of the stuff that we do, if it really resonated with you, I'd love to connect. And maybe Christy can connect us over email or whatnot. But yeah, that's all I have for you. I just want to leave it open to some discussion. Any questions, any thoughts, like what blew your mind? Is there anything you want to add that maybe wasn't in there? Like, just let me, like, what do you think?
Just, this is sort of on the subject, but this past Friday, went to the Benedum Center to see a musical called Six, and it's about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And it was really, it's very entertaining because it's kind of funny, but they sing and they each tell their story. Like there's 6 women and each one represents a different wife. And it was educational, but it was funny, and you know, it, like I said, very entertaining. They danced, they sang, and brought some lightheartedness, but also it was like so much darkness about how these women were treated. It's, you know, I mean, I'm just not a super big history buff, but learned a lot about how women were, you know, what they all went through and abuse and all this kind of thing. But anyway, just throwing that out there as far as for women's, it's a really cool thing. I think it's gone. They were only here for a few days for it, but if you ever have a chance, it's a really great production. So
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it was really good. So it's been going on for a long time, as we well know, but it's just interesting, yeah, that, you know, what women went through and their children as well. And, you know, 2 of his wives were beheaded, and, you know, it's just sort of a lot, yeah, so.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah.
Like I said, I was reading an account of a woman in, like, a Jewish woman in Germany in the 1600s, and it, like, so much of it was just like, this is bonkers, like, I can't believe this happened, but a lot of it was current, and you know, it felt like I could connect with a lot of the challenges at the time. It just looks a little different today.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. The challenges are still there. They just appear in different forms. And it's sad to say that in the year 2023, we're still struggling with this, you know, this battle. And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. It is. I mean, and I think, you know, just, it's really important to talk about it. Like,
And I
my
think
mother-in-law, go on.
I was gonna say, I think your figure that you put out there, the $13 per hour that would be generated, it just makes no sense. And you have to say that, you know, I wonder if this was something that was, you know, more of a male issue, wouldn't we be in a totally different place? Because it seems like when women bring up money and they bring up savings and those issues, it just kind of gets downplayed and people are like, that's not really true. But if you look at other things where governments have looked at, you know, really, what is the cost savings? This isn't even a savings. This is a generation of income. You know, governments would jump on it, but it just seems to me, because it is, you know, believed to only affect, you know, 50% of the folks. It's crazy they don't do that. And really, the reality is it's a lot more than that, because it also impacts men as well. I mean, there are males that are dealing with childcare issues just as much as females are. I mean, not on the highest, not on to the same extent, but it is true. I mean, there are men that are single parents. There are men who are not the primary breadwinners in their house. And they will, I mean, I work with clients who their wives make more and they would love to go back to work, but they're, you know, staying at home. They're the dad at home, but you know, because of childcare, it's just crazy.
Yeah, no, we talk about that. My spouse, like, he would be the best stay-at-home dad, but it's just like he has this like great tech salary, right? And it really, like, it's fantastic, and it allows us to have, like, you know, a good life. And it's like, oh, I wish, you know, I wish I could let you be a stay-at-home dad, but that's, I kind of envy people who are able to pull that off. But yeah, you're right. It's not the same, but I do think that like they just in the federal government, they just started a congressional dads caucus. And they're talking a lot about these issues, and they recognize how kind of unfair it is. But I think that's something that like men can do, is use that voice, like recognize that society is going to listen to me more. So I think that men can be able to be that voice a little bit for us. Give me 5 more minutes, okay? She's putting on my makeup. It looks amazing. But yeah, I think men need to be able to be those allies, to share some of these stories and boost some of these stories. I think there's a lot of power there. And it's interesting because, I noticed you said that governments, like actually most other governments fund this. That 13-to-1 example first came out of Montreal, which is not far from here. And they have guaranteed, free or low cost, depending on your income, childcare. Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Any more thoughts while we're wrapping up?
We do have to wrap up because it's time to go back to work. But as much as we could stay far longer, Abby, we thank you so much. These are things that I'm of a certain age. It's in the back of my head. My children are grown, but when statistics come up and you put it in black and white, I really learned a lot today. So, and I think we all did. And we thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Abby.
Yeah, and everyone, for your clients like Bethany, she's from the Salvation Army. She's the director for Chartiers Valley. You could be MomsWork can be a resource for our partners as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really enjoyed putting this together. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot too.